Hi, this is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. I'm very pleased today to have Sonia Elijah, who's written a wonderful new book. It's called 311, Viral Takeover, now available on Amazon. She's an example of this sort of intrepid independent journalist that we've absolutely required for the last 5, 6 years in order to make sense of our times. The major media sort of dropped the ball. Academic institutions did hardly anything. We needed independent voices to follow what was going on, just if nothing else, than to just tell the story of our times. Who's doing what to whom, who's lying about what the authorities did that was inconsistent with traditional public health rules, and so on. And it's a gigantic topic because it covers infectious disease, censorship, digital surveillance, government malfeasance in terms of fiscal policy, medical science. It's just so many issues, political maneuverings. It's huge, and I've always had this concern from the beginning that the story would not be told. Why is it important to tell the story? It's because something that's bothered me from the very beginning of this crisis, namely, like, how would historians look back at this? Would it be that a bad virus, with zoonotic origin came from China? The world tried to stop it. It couldn't stop it, but fortunately we got a shot in time, and that fixed the problem and the world moved on. I mean, I think that version of events is something like what the court historians would tell. The truth is very different. And I've been a voracious reader of people who have a different version of events. Brownstone's published a number of these books. In fact, Brownstone was started when Gigi Foster and her two co-authors sent me a manuscript to their original book on the COVID crisis, and this was in the late summer of 2021, and it made me realize, this is a brilliant book and nobody else is going to publish it, so I have to be the one. And we didn't have any money, didn't have any resources, but it was an example of something that just drives you to do the right thing. And ever since then, we've published now 22 or 23 books, not all on COVID, some on different topics, but all related to the Brownstone's mission. During these years, I've had the highest respect for Sonia because she's just one of these great journalists who's very precise in her documentation and argumentation. She has a Substack and has occupied a very important, prominent place in the English-speaking world to document this crisis. Her book focuses, I would say, just necessarily on the UK experience because, she's in the UK, but what's strange about it is how the experience of the UK just so closely overlaps with that of the US. I mean, it's like a mirror images of each other in some way, even down to the timing and the protocols. And the same is true for many European countries and even Latin American and African countries. I mean, it really was a kind of global response. I urge you to get this book. It is an important document for the ages. I was honored to write the foreword for it, but it's important to own and to read. I would say of all the UK journalists, she's easily got the best fix on everything that's going on. And the other reason for getting a book like this and having it, holding it and keeping it and passing it around is that we don't want to forget. I mean, this is, I think, part of the ethos of our times is that because that previous version of events is known to be false by virtually everybody now, there's a great effort just instead to sweep it all under the carpet and say, it doesn't matter, let's move on to the next thing, whatever it happens to be. And now, as I'm talking to you, we all know what that next thing is. It's war. And I've checked my own intuitions about this all the way dating back to 2020. Somehow, in the back of my mind, I thought this is all going to end with a war. That aside, let's not participate in the great game of change the subject. Sonia, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for inviting me.
So this has been a 5-year-long project. I'm almost intimidated when I look at the range of the topics you cover and how with such stability and documentation with which you covered it. How could you possibly have ever managed to achieve something like this? I can't even fathom it.
Oh, wow. Bit by bit, chipping away, Jeffrey, chipping away. I would say yes, 5 years of investigative reporting, but I would say I became quite focused on the book probably about 3.5 years ago, and sort of pulling it all together. But what really I think anchored the book and helped me craft it was the timeline that I compiled. And I think that was quite crucial for pulling everything together and trying not to miss out on anything that was really important, because that really mattered to me, was to get a really holistic picture of what went on. And so yeah, it was a mammoth task, and I would say by the grace of God, it got finished. It was really a miracle, and I really wanted it to be finished just before March the 11th of this year to launch the book. So I was really writing even up until January of this year. I was still working on the final chapter, and the book has a very nice, I think, an arc to it. There really is there's a direction to it, and it all sort of holds together really well because it's all tied to evidence and to the truth.
Yeah. When did you choose to start your timeline? By the way, before you answer that, I will say that the 6th anniversary somehow seems more prescient than any of the previous ones. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's just because we have some distance with it and we're able to think a little more clearly about it or something. I don't know, but everybody's talking about it now, the 6th anniversary, in ways in which they didn't talk about the 5th, the 4th, the 3rd.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I'm not sure why the 6th year is more, yes, is sort of more in the forefront now. I think, is it because more people are waking up, more people are researching for themselves and coming to that realization. But going back to your question, when I started the timeline, I started it January 2019. It starts with Crimson Contagion, the pandemic exercises, pandemic simulation exercises. But actually, the final chapter does bring it back 2 decades prior. And I look at Project BioShield, I look at the rise of Robert Cadleck, and sort of this rise of the biodefense industrial complex. That does stretch 2 decades. But the timeline starts, January 2019, all the way up to sort of, I would say, the fall of 2021, when we've got the drastic leak of the diffuse proposal document, which was, very interesting. So, yeah, that helped.
Is it your view that in January with Crimson Contagion, which there are a number of these exercises, that happens to be the one that stands out to me the most. I'm not sure why that is, but is it your view that well, tell me what your view is of Crimson Contagion. How was that a practice for some unknown eventuality, or was it a plan for what might be coming soon?
It was, yes. I mean, it's planning, isn't it? It's sort of getting sort of the ducks in the row, so to speak. And it was obviously led by the US Department of Health and Human Services. Robert Cadleck was critical in orchestrating that event, Crimson Contagion. It's centered around a group of US tourists that traveled to China, contracted a novel influenza, came back and spread it across the US. But then following that, we have in the fall of 2019, we've got Event 201, which actually I think says so much more. Because there we have, again, it's all top level public health officials gathering together, including the head of the Chinese CDC at the time as well. And you have them coming to a conclusion that governments and private entities, and particularly social media companies, need to work in lockstep on nimble approaches to counter disinformation.
Yeah.
So, and then, I mean, you have that laid bare, and then going into, post 3/11, when the pandemic is declared by the World Health Organization, you have literally, even I think on March 27th, you have the Trusted News Initiative going into action, being expanded to cover countering COVID disinformation. Almost 2 weeks just after the pandemic was declared. They already have misinformation on their radar, and they're very quick to attack that. So
this is why the timeline is so important, because all this stuff unfolds very quickly. From the late January, where Fauci and Farrar are claiming to have these phone calls, panicked about the lab leak and everything. And wondering what to do. Well, let's just tell everybody it was a zoonotic origin, right? And
yes.
so, and then a month later, a month and a half later, I guess, you have the pandemic declared by the World Health Organization. Then you have the great junket to China, right, taken by U.S. officials, UK officials, going to Wuhan to see how brilliantly the CDC managed this. And then I think that that World Health Organization report on urging the entire world to copy China it was released maybe 24th, 25th, 26th of February, something like that. And then immediately on the 27th, you've got the Trusted News Initiative. And it was about this time that all the world's press began to broadcast, the pathogenic fear, and really generate a kind of public hysteria. That was, I think it was the 28th, where the New York Times ran its first big fear. Well, 27th, I guess, was the big first fear mongering podcast, and then the next day was a Dazik and so on, and the newspaper talking about disease X. So it all happened very quickly, didn't it?
It did. It really did. And what I found, just going back to even, January 2020, don't you remember, you have Sir Jeremy Farrar, who was leading the Wellcome Trust at the time, posting on Twitter, as it was known then, and thanking China, saying China is setting a new standard for outbreak response and deserves all our thanks. Okay. And what did we know at China? What they were doing? They were welding people's apartment doors, sealing them shut. And I mean, the whole city going into lockdown, and people, screaming from their balconies. And it was just awful what you saw. And you have Jeremy Farrar, praising China for its outbreak response.
Let me ask you a question of something I'm not entirely settled in my mind. What is the connection between, clearly the plotting of the lockdowns from late January, or if not from a year earlier, and the insistence on the part of Fauci and so many others that this was not a lab leak? What is the relationship between those two things, if any?
What is the relation, just to reiterate your question, the relationship between the lab leak and locking down?
Well, the denial of the lab leak and the locking down. Like, what do you think was going on? Let me just put it that way.
I mean, I believe lockdowns was a global sort of an experiment to see how far people would comply. I see that as almost like a stress test. They wanted to see how far people would go. And as we saw, because I mean, just going back to the title of the book, why I chose 3/11, it is the biological sequel of 9/11, and how in 9/11 we saw this sort of state surveillance of citizens. 3/11, we're seeing citizens compliant with the state, very obedient and following the rules. Why they were denying, I mean, obviously, they're all protecting their own, themselves, right? Because many of these scientists who wrote these papers, who cemented the natural origin theory, many of them were gain of function scientists themselves and were protecting their own livelihoods as well. But I mean, lockdowns to me was just one mass global experiment, and they wanted to see how far they could take it. And we saw a huge shift, of course, a transfer of wealth. Let's not forget, huge transfer of wealth at that time. And what is interesting, as I'm just going to use the example of the Wellcome Trust. We have during lockdown, so we know that Jeremy Farrar was a key member of SAGE, which is the scientific advisory group of experts advising the UK government at the time. The Wellcome Trust, their portfolio, their sort of fund, their value as a sort of NGO grew substantially through that time because of their investments in companies like DoorDash. And DoorDash is a delivery of, food delivery company. They were the early investors of DoorDash, if you look at their portfolio. And look how they profited so handsomely when the world locked down.
And probably other things in that portfolio would include Moderna, Pfizer.
Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All pharmaceutical linked. Yes.
And at what point was it the case that, so it took me 2 years to realize that the purpose of the lockdown, like the lockdown was never going to be for 2 weeks. You agree with that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It was never going to be 2 weeks to flatten the curve.
Right. So the plan from the outset was to stay locked down as long as possible to release the shot, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And when do you think, okay, so that it took me a long time to realize that because it's just so dark and weird. But now I'm absolutely certain of it. I asked another person who would certainly be in the know how long it took him, and he said it took him 2 years, even after the lockdowns, to fully realize that that was the plan from the beginning. So when do you think it became the preferred method of response to lockdown until vaccinate? You think that was January of 2020?
When did they decide on this is what they were going to do?
Yeah.
I mean, what is really interesting is sort of the Boris Johnson's sort of his U-turn, because in the beginning we have of January 2020, you also have the UK HSA at the time. It was renamed. It was something different before, saying, "Oh, this is not it's not so serious, this virus." Okay, so they lowered the criteria. They lowered it down. But then all of a sudden you have Neil Ferguson's paper. Now, Neil Ferguson's paper, Report 9, and he was a professor who made catastrophic, flawed predictions in the past with swine flu, with foot and mouth disease, all based on his modeling. So we have these mathematical models going on, and he and his team at top London University saying that if the world didn't lock down, if we didn't go into lockdown, and to mitigate the spread of the virus, then I think we'd have like 500 million deaths within 3 months, looking at the US, looking at UK, looking all across the different countries. So that paper was critical in using it as a tool of fear to get the governments also, everyone followed suit, the US, the UK. So I really feel that flawed paper was quite critical. in
Remind me what
locking down.
date that was. When was the Imperial College?
March 17th, I think it was. I think that was March 17th. When did that come? Um,
That sounds
I'm just looking at the
a little
timeline.
late to me. Well, it may have been.
Maybe March 16th was when it was. March 16th was when it was. I think that's when, but it got released earlier. So when it became publicly available is a different date to when they released it to, leading officials.
With
So
the
we've got to
model
be,
flatten the curve, because I think even by the 16th we already had the flatten the curve
yeah,
thing going. So yeah, it was already leaked ahead of time. All top
yeah.
government officials and the Johnson administration got a copy of this. And is it your view that Boris Johnson just got scared?
The U-turn happened. I mean, based on that report, there was like a 90-degree sort of switch. We knew that something, why is he doing this? Obviously, he did apparently allegedly get the virus. He went to hospital. He was very ill with it. We don't know what happened. I can't, speculate on what went on. But there was a definite U-turn, and he didn't want to lock down, and I think he was definitely forced to. And he was surrounded by all these sage advisors, and I go into the book. I think that the first. Chapter 3 looks at SAGE and their conflicts of interest, many of them tied to Gavi, World Economic Forum, the Bill Gates Foundation, pharmaceutical companies, many with links. So a lot of conflicts of interest there.
Yeah, and this was very much overlays almost identically with the Trump administration. Very similar situation, right? I mean, for Trump, he seemed to have changed his mind on March 10th, like between the 9th and the 10th, it shifted in the other direction. And it was roughly the same time as Boris Johnson. They must have been on the phone or something. I don't know. I don't know how this all fleshed
Yeah,
itself out.
yeah.
It seems remarkable that, and both of them ended up, and then it's kind of embarrassing because both these guys have been saying for like a month before, look, this is a seasonal virus. We'll get through it. We're going to be okay, Now, have you done how closely analysis have you done of those WhatsApp messages that were leaked from within the cabinet?
I've looked at them a bit. I mean, obviously, we know that, it's they were using the fear to coerce people to sort of lock down, to follow the rules, and a lot of hypocrisy. I mean, the book goes into a lot of the lockdown parties that were prevalent. So telling people one thing, to stay at home, stay indoors, stay at home order, and you can't say goodbye to your loved ones dying in care homes. You can't attend funerals of your loved ones, or maybe maximum of 6 people spaced apart, right? And then you had these lockdown parties, in the UK and definitely in the US. I think you had a leading public health official in New York City attending many, drug-fueled parties. And
They were even called sex parties, which is just
the sex parties, yes.
yeah. It's unbelievable.
And
That news came and went so fast in the U.S. I can't even tell you. I was like,
yeah. So the hypocrisy. So they knew, and we knew early on also that it had the infection fatality rate of about roughly 0.1%, which is comparable to a severe flu season. That was all known. They all knew it, and hence going to these parties and these cheese and wine soirees.
yeah, it seems unbelievable. But in the big picture, your theme of this book is that it was, in fact, to a test of compliance, a test of a new vaccination platform.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, I've really done a lot of research into the shots, and just to bring us back to the early 2020, let's not forget February 4th, 2020. We have the Alex Azar, right, who was leading HHS at the time, invoking the PrEP Act. And this is 35 days before the World Health Organization declared it to be a pandemic. 35 days before you've got the PrEP Act being invoked for countermeasures, right? So again, all the vaccine manufacturers, they've the liability, all that liability being waived for them. We mustn't forget that BioNTech, who partnered with Pfizer and also Moderna, did not have a single product approved to market prior to 311. That is huge. They didn't have one product they were able to be greenlit and bring to market prior to 311. And this mRNA platform was already proven to be highly toxic when they were trying it with all these different other viruses. They failed,
Yeah,
animals died.
it was not approved in the US or the UK or anywhere, really, right?
No, yeah. So
Despite
globally, yeah,
a
yeah.
30-year investment, right? I mean, it's a very old
Yeah,
investment in this technology, and it
yeah.
just was never could get approved.
Yeah, and DARPA was heavily involved in the beginning. So my book does talk a lot about the history and the rise of the mRNA platform, the rise of Moderna, and we had DARPA holding Moderna's hand, step by step, all the way, all the grants, right, and including grants to BioNTech as well. So it really is. Yeah, they've been planning to bring it into the market for decades, and I think they were waiting for a crisis moment, a disruptive event to bring that in. And don't forget, there was a key seminar that went on. Now I'm going to probably forget the date. I think it was in 2019, and you have I think it was Rick Bright, who was head of BARDA at the time. And you've got him and Fauci on a panel with other people. And they were discussing this need for a disruptive event to blow up the system of the traditional vaccine development, how they produce vaccines. That needed to be blown up to bring an mRNA platform. So I think it was by the Milken Institute in New York City, and it's obviously it's in the book, and that's very interesting.
Yeah, so you have this February 4th. I don't know why I hadn't quite put that together. That February 4th was the PrEP Act, so they were already preparing for it. Do you think they imagined a shorter timeline between, to get the products to market than it turned out to be the case?
Well, I mean, they had it, I think 63 days when they had it shipped out. I'm talking about Moderna. Now, if you look at, initially they wanted, do you remember that you have DARPA go with its 3P platform, and they wanted to get a countermeasure from the time they do the sequencing to being shipped out 60 days was like their goal. Moderna did it in 63 days. So pretty close for it to be shipped out. Not for it to be approved and go through all the trials. But yeah, I mean, we had Operation Warp Speed. So it was an unprecedented, the way they pushed it through, and got it green lit around the world.
But in the in the U.S., I'm not sure when it was finally available in the U.K., but the shots weren't. For one thing, in the U.S., they had to delay the release until after the election, right? probably for political reasons. But I don't have any proof of that. 'Cause, look, nobody actually knows what Trump was told in second week of March when that changed his position. But it seems reasonable to assume that they told him, yeah, we're going to get these shots out in 60 days, and then everybody will get them, inoculate the population. You'll be a great hero. I think that's reasonable. Do you think that's a reasonable assumption?
Yeah, I agree with you there. I absolutely agree with you. Do
You think
I
they
mean,
told
it's
Boris
just,
something similar? Boris Johnson something similar?
well, yeah, I mean, they wanted to be seen as heroes, right? You know, it's again, the vaccine is seen as this savior, and they're sort of seen ushering in the savior of the vaccine. So they want to be seen as heroes for that. But we knew, I mean, the book goes into a lot of evidence of the harms known before emergency use authorization was given. I particularly focus on this FDA presentation slide of October 2020. That's in one of the chapters with exhibits. I mean, the book has a lot of images, screenshots, and a lot of the harms were known. You've got the myocarditis, you've got strokes, you've got a lot of neurological conditions, and they had that on their radar. This is the FDA. So yeah, I mean those list of harms just grew and grew.
Yeah, none of which were probably. Well, let me just put it this way. I'm trying to think about it from the point of view of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. I mean, they're political leaders. Maybe they're just mannequins, marionettes. But they had to be convinced to go along with this in some way. Maybe they didn't. They had no particular reason to ask a question like, "Is this product safe?" Because they were surrounded by all sorts of scientists who were telling them it's been tested for 20 years. We know what we're doing. We're gonna solve this problem and prevent mass death. And is it possible that the safety and even the point about not stopping transmission, which is unbearably obvious if you know anything about respiratory viruses with zoonotic reservoirs, but would that necessarily have been obvious to somebody like Trump or Johnson?
Yeah. I mean, you raised an important point about transmission, which I'd like to speak to. So we know that the Pfizer clinical trials protocol, they never designed for it to stop transmission. It was never, that was never part of the protocol. And BMJ actually did an article on that, highlighting that their flawed protocol. So these clinical trials was sort of they never designed it to prevent transmission. And don't forget, they also changed the definition of a vaccine. Do you remember that? They changed the definition, which is also very critical.
Well, I knew
point.
that it migrated to become something that like people think of a vaccine as being sterilized, which was probably not entirely correctly. But we tend to think, but based on history and common knowledge, we assume that if you get shot, you're not going to get the thing against which the shot wires your immune system to protect. But I knew it was changed sort of informally. In what sense was the definition like changed, and in what channels and who did it, and how was that broadcast?
It was by the CDC. So it was the CDC website. You can see it changed. I do point to it. I can't remember at the top of my head the exact wording, but it's to do with protection. It's all based on about immunity, whether it gives you immunity or protect. It's just they play around with the words, and it was the CDC changing the definition.
Yeah. So suddenly the vaccine becomes protective, which is a. Am I right to think that that this claim is kind of non-falsifiable in a sense? Like people would often post all over social media, "I got the shot. I've got COVID. I feel terrible. I went to the hospital, whatever. But fortunately, because I got the shot, it was not as bad as it might have been otherwise." I mean, How would one
I
know
mean,
that?
yeah. I mean, and what is really also interesting and is that the definition of being vaccinated, okay, you had to, it was they didn't consider you being vaccinated if you just got a single shot. It was 3 weeks after you got your second shot, you were considered vaccinated. And you had a spike of deaths, right? And Professor Norman Fenton, based in the UK, did a great paper with Dr. Claire Craig and other great scientists to show how the ONS, which is the Office of National Statistics in the UK, manipulated the data. So they declared so they were actually vaccinated, but they declared them to be unvaccinated. So they showed that unvaccinated people were dying, but they were vaccinated. So they literally, I mean, again, you've got a lot of manipulation of the data going there.
So the point you're just now making is still to this day not well understood. So if you go to Our World in Data, even now, you can look at deaths by vaccination status, and it shows unvaccinated dying at a much higher rate than the vaccinated. But it was true in Canada and the US and the UK, and I don't know how many other countries. The definition of being vaccinated was 2 or 3 weeks after your second shot. So if you died anywhere between the first shot, maybe you died from the shot, and your second shot, and maybe you died from the second shot, and you died 10 days after your second shot from the shot, you're listed as a COVID death, unvaccinated COVID death.
Unvaccinated. And you saw a spike of elderly people dying after their first jab. And that got all whitewashed away, you see. Very manipulative I
get so tired of explaining this. And even now, if you just do a quick Google around, you land on Our World in Data, it will give you a seemingly decisive chart proving that the vaccine protected people against death.
All smoke and mirrors, right?
What's that?
Yeah. All smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And and when you try to explain this to people, they think, "What are you, some kind of conspiracy theorist?" No, I mean, you're explaining. And it seems like too much to be believed. Okay, so just quickly about one slight difference between, I think, the UK experience and the US experience is that, so now you have a problem. You've got to keep the population sort of whipped up in a frenzy about this disease, masking, endless washing of hands, social distancing, doing this kabuki dance theater of disease protection. And you've got to do this for a long time. I mean, like 8 months or something. I mean, it's just unbelievable that the audaciousness of this plan from the very beginning is just it boggles the mind, really. But during which time you kept having to have generating new reasons why people's lives should be in such upheaval and their towns shut down and masking. The U.S., we never experienced like a shortage of medical personnel or hospital space or resources to deal with. And this became very obvious early on because, I mean, there was a flare up in New York when they redirected everybody to like 2 hospitals, and there was like this thing happening. But it was very brief. The rest of the country, all the hospitals were empty. But like parking lots for the first time in the history of the hospital, completely empty, and the nurses are choreographing dances, because they didn't have any patients, right? But the UK was slightly different in the sense that, like, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But there was a single-minded focus on saving resources for the National Health Service, right?
Yeah. when it was all about stay home, protect, save save the NHS, no, protect, sorry, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. That was the
Protect
mantra. That
the
was the message.
NHS.
That's
They,
right.
they don't
Protect
give
it from
them you
getting
don't give them your business, because then they'll just run out of resources. And everybody already knows, like, the wait times the NHS are already a
yeah.
vexing problem in UK medicine, right?
Also, I just want to raise an important point that's quite timely. So, just on March 19th, just past, we have the UK COVID inquiry now saying that that government messaging, the stay-at-home messaging, protect the NHS, may have inadvertently sent the message that healthcare was closed, and that could have cost lives. We know loads of people too scared to go out, to go to hospital, they died in their homes. All, rising cancers, all, just heart attacks, all of these things. They stayed home and they died. And they and so you have now they're very very sort of careful with their words, the UK COVID inquiry, but at least you have it now on record that they do, that
That seems like a big concession. In fact, because for the most part, I don't know how many parts this COVID commission is going to be, and it's like, chapter 187 or something. There's just so much. But the part I read concluded that the UK should have locked down sooner and harder, right?
Oh, yes, they have to put in that. They have to always do that. Which really is, I mean, the book really, I do dissect a lot of the transcripts. These are the testimonies given under oath by a lot of these key experts who were members of SAGE at the time, who were all proponents for the lockdown. And, I really dissect those transcripts. And it's just really, they absolutely used weaponized fear. They used coercion, and this is in the government white papers. So you have a very key, I think it's around mid-March 2020, you have a SAGE meeting going on where they absolutely say, I mean, I've actually even highlighted it in the book, you've got use media to increase sense of personal threat. So you have that, and so I've got a screenshot of that in the book. So this is in their meetings. This is the SBIB subcommittee, and the report goes on to state how they're going to use coercion. They're going to explicitly use that in order to change people's behavior. It's all about modifying behavior, nudging people to follow the rules. So this is a covert psychological operation going on, right? And it's in black and white there. And they used it against the public. We know that as well as censorship, and we haven't really discussed that much. I mean, with the Trusted News Initiative, how we had citizens under surveillance. And I mean, it's really, if you really sort of sit back and think about it, it's like a movie. You can't. The mind boggles what they got away with.
So, and I always keep going back to, like, what was the point of this entire thing? So it's to test level of population compliance, to test mechanisms of controlling the public mind, right, with censorship and that sort of thing. But then fundamentally, it was to test a new technology, a new pharmaceutical technology. But what's strange about it always struck me as strange that we know that the only medically significant consequences of COVID itself were restricted to an elderly population that was infirm for the most part. And in that way, it's different from a typical flu season, which actually harms a broader range of the public. But why then? And you believe you have this miracle inoculation, whatever, and you want to try it. Why was the ambition to get 90% of the population vaccinated? Was it, or at least that's what Fauci would say in the US. Was it just to sell more product?
I mean, I would absolutely. I think partly, yes, get more shots in the arms, get more products sold. But also, we've missed out on the key point, which I do mention in the book, is the introduction of vaccine passports. I do think vaccine passports is key because I see that vaccine passports being a gateway to digital IDs. And this is the landscape what we're in now, Jeffrey, is we are seeing this rise in digital authoritarianism. We're seeing this real push for digital IDs and vaccine passports. There were proof of concept that it worked, that we got people to use these QR codes, and your vaccination status in order to just be part of society, in order to go to the theater, in order to fly and get on a plane, in order to travel, in order to go to work. I mean, it's so yeah, it's just really,
Did you
really
have
disturbing.
physical proof of vaccination, like a piece of paper, or was everything digital?
It's like an app. You would download this NHS app and it would show it. And every country had their own one, every country. And then you obviously have the EU. I know in different states in the US, they had their passes, these sort of COVID, these passes to be able to fly, in Canada as well. And so, so I really think the vaccine passports was that was key, to get people to comply with that, and literally give up their freedoms to, that's the way they would get their freedoms. It's by complying. And then it's really incredible if you think about it. But what I do talk about is the resistance to it, which is the freedom truckers in Canada, that whole protest. And that was based on, to sort of push back against these vaccine passports. And we know what happened to the truckers and all their, supporters. We had their bank accounts frozen. You've got debanking going on. You've got Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act that had never been invoked before. It's just incredible, and we are now in a very I would say we're sort of at that precipice of like this digital authoritarianism that the West seems to be sort of sliding into.
with
In China.
no break in it, right? But back to the vaccine passports in the U.S. What happened is that New York, I think New York was one of the few states that actually got its act together in time. Just as a slight footnote to this, before the shots came out, the tech companies all innovated apps for purposes of isolation and disease control from COVID. So, like Apple had an app that you could download that you could walk around with you, and if you got near somebody with COVID, it would sound an alarm and say, "Oh, stay away from this person. This person has COVID." Because the only way you would know that is if you got a PCR test and uploaded that to Apple, because there's other ways, no way to know this. So this is like a digital leper bell. This is like the stupidest thing. I can't even believe this happened, but this actually happened because if you downloaded something like that, it's your own fault. But New York started its own passport system, but
Yes.
the rest of the states in the U.S., we had little vaccine cards which were easily forged, and you'll never know how many forgeries there were. I mean, there might have been 10%, might have been half, might have been 90%. We'll never know how many of these things were forged because you easily download it online and fill it in. That was your vaccine passport. New York attempted a digital passport. It was going to spend millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars more, developing this app. But it quickly fell into disuse because people coming into New York from Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, or anywhere, even if they're vaccinated, could not use that app. right? So it became
Right.
useless for them. So
Right.
and then the app just broke down and eventually was just deleted from the app store. So it was a complete flop here. But in the UK, it was one app for England, Scotland, uh, Wales, and Ireland, right?
Yeah, yeah. You have the NHS. It was an NHS app. And don't forget the companies that design these apps. I mean, they must have made so much money, of taxpayers' money. And we haven't even talked about the testing, right? I mean, I've written a lot about the COVID testing and the scams involved in that. I mean, it's just, you have the UK government spending £4 billion of taxpayers' money, all going to a California startup using Chinese made lateral flow tests that the FDA said throw them in the trash. But the NHS continue to double down and just give one company this contract. So you have that's known as the VIP lane contract, where you have this sort of fast track approval of these tests by these companies, and it's coming from nowhere. No one knew about them. And I mean, for example, Innova Medical Group was founded right at the time, right around March, 3/11. March 2020 was when it was founded. It's
The
just
story
so.
is so crazy. Sonia, I just tell you really quickly because I remember these early days and desperately looking for dissidents to join me from the UK, but they really weren't. I mean, there was a lot of censorship, so it was hard to find. I think it was a long time before I found you, but there was one guy associated. I forget his name now, but he was associated with the Adam Smith Institute. Now he was, which is a sort of a UK sort of Tory think tank of some sort. And he was raging against the lockdowns. These are bad. These are bad. And at some point, he changed his mind and endorsed the lockdowns. And the reason was, it was so interesting to me. He said, look, the story of the people who are against lockdowns is too convoluted and requires too many implausible claims at once. Death myth classification, incorrect PCR readings, a plot by the pharmaceutical companies, um, uh, you know, manipulation of the data of the cause of death, and so he said, these are too many things to all be true, and I don't believe it. So I'm going to go the other direction and assume somebody knows something I don't. I'm for the lockdowns, right? Do you understand? You understand there's so many pieces here that are so implausibly connected. It seems beyond belief.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like a movie, right? Just, a plot of a film, you just can't. I mean, I guess he's the case of sort of burying their head in the sand. I mean, many people still do, still bury their head in the sand. They can't believe that their government would do this to them, or that the BBC would lie, right? There's a lot of to get them to sort of really wake up and sort of use their critical thinking skills it can be quite hard to do, because it's just they'd much rather remain ignorant, I guess.
And then also in the UK, you had this tremendous hysteria. There's so many over air filtration. Like everybody needs to install an air filtrator, every filtration system, every bar, every restaurant, every pub, everything, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and those companies did well, didn't they? They did very well. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, going back to, I would say, this censorship. I think that's a really important conversation to have, because you have, the Trusted News Initiative, because you have a mass sort of brainwashing campaign going on as well. We've got sort of, led by the BBC, because it helms the TNI, the Trusted News Initiative, crosses big tech, all the legacy media. And that's why you had, all the headlines were the same, especially with, let's not forget the blacklisting of the, ivermectin,
And
hydroxychloroquine,
that happened in
all
the
these.
UK also, right? I mean, it's the
Oh,
same exact
absolutely.
thing. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Well, did you? I'm still a little bit astonished to now that you're mapping it out like this. It still just amazes me. But did you ever imagine that the civilized, highly educated, much trusted news media of the UK would have been so completely compliant with regime priorities and such uniformity and such speed?
Well, I mean, they're a government mouthpiece, right? They're funded through, the TV license. Essentially, they're state funded, the BBC. So yeah, it's propaganda. And my book also talks about NATO's involvement in the propaganda and the inoculation games that they put out there, and that's really very insidious.
Yeah, some people, when looking for a first cause to this whole thing, do point to NATO as being the place to look.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote, and it's in the book, I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to DCIT, which is the Department of Science and Innovation and Technology in the UK. They're a branch of the government. And I asked them for all the meetings, all the notes, emails, communications with NATO in reference to the how they guided the disinformation policy around the COVID shots. And they admitted that, yes, they do have all of that information, but they're not going to give it because it would threaten national security or would be used to further sort of misinformation, be misinterpreted. Now, that reminded me exactly the same excuse, the response given by the UK HSA when key scientists even took them to court to try and get them to release the data linking excess deaths to the COVID vaccines. And they refused to give the data. And this is anonymized data. So no one's going to be, no one's names of, people who had been deceased. It was just purely anonymized data. And they refused to give it because it would, again, fuel misinformation, and relatives of the deceased would get very angry or upset. And they used that as their way of, that was their excuse.
Yeah, the truth is too shocking, really. So we just can't tell it.
And
In the course of your research, I mean, you have probably hundreds of moments where you were just shocked and amazed at what you were discovering. What are the standout pieces for you?
I mean, I think the standout pieces in the sense of just the pain and the harms and what I was just the horrific, I mean, what to do with the vaccine harms and these are the internal reports. So these are the periodic safety update reports given by, compiled by Pfizer and BioNTech and submitted to the European Medicine Agency. And I was given access to those reports and I really did a deep dive through those. And it's just, children dying, 6-year-olds, myocarditis, just a few days after the shot. And then you have the Pfizer assessor saying, it has nothing to do. It's not related to the shot at all. This is unrelated. And it's just every death, unrelated, according to Pfizer. And you just have the EMA going along with it and rubber stamping it. I mean, just really awful. And these are children who are dying, right? Who've died post-vaccination. And now, obviously, you have the FDA looking into these child deaths. I mean, wasn't that done? That was headline news quite recently. They were doing a proper investigation into a child death.
See, I doubt it. But
what, 5 years too late?
Yeah, and plus, I doubt. I don't think it's ever going to happen, actually. But that's just my sense of it. Okay, so there's just So the point is that once the decision was made, we are going to have an inoculation. We've gone through all this headache. We've disrupted the economies of 194 nations. There's no way we're not going to deliver a product at this point. So it didn't matter, really. The trials didn't matter, right? It was already a done deal.
Yeah, I do think the trials were like theatre. Yeah. They were going to get greenlit either way, because I've dug through those clinical trial documents. This was released, again, this was that, the group of medical professionals who had written actually a lot, relentlessly to the FDA, freedom of information requests, asking for all the documents that the FDA relied on to authorize the Pfizer vaccine. And they wanted access to those documents. Obviously, as you know, the FDA, they pushed back. They said, no, we have to wait till 2096 or something. Anyway, they got released. I looked through all those early on. This is from late 2021. I was looking at those reports. And we had that initial report, I think it was a cumulative analysis of adverse event reports for the first 3 months that the vaccine was rolled out. And we had 1,228 deaths in that 3-month period. You had women 3 times more affected by adverse events. You had all the neurological conditions. I mean, you had 8 pages of adverse events listed as well.
I remember seeing that. I was shocked. I mean, just like every disease known to man was listed over.
I mean, I was one of the first journalists to report on that and to write on that. That was for Trials Site News. I was interestingly, this ties in with censorship as well. I was interviewed by an Australian media company. This is end of 2021, and Calkine Media, I believe, and it was on YouTube. They had a YouTube channel. It got 3 million views. It went viral. The interview on me on that, based on my digging and going through that report, that Pfizer report, it got taken down. YouTube just took it down. So, and I'm just using their own report. I'm using their own data, and this is not my it's not conjecture. And it got taken down. So really, the censorship is key to all of this. And that's how they got away with it, is the censorship, is the all the dissenting scientists, as you know, Jeffrey, the blacklisting, the attacks, the smearing, and you had all those scientific articles who, raising the red flag, raising the alarm about these harms, these mRNA harms. They got retracted, withdrawn, back to back. And that my book documents that as well. So you have the censorship of the dissenting scientists and the data. And the vaccine injured, let's not forget what happened to them. They had their Facebook accounts taken down. You had the BBC involved in that because they were using carrot emojis to circumvent the censors. And you have the BBC flagging big tech, Facebook, saying this is what this group's doing. You better take down their accounts. Their accounts got taken down. It's just, I mean, it goes on and on.
The YouTube itself announced at some point a policy that they would not allow any video on their platform that contradicts what the World Health Organization, says. I guess that's dialed back slightly, but not really. I mean, a lot. But even now, I mean, I have warning messages on all like this video will go on YouTube, but it'll come with a CDC sticker, right? Like for correct information. And we got dinged twice. And it's odd to say, only the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization at some point in late 21, I think it was deep into the vaccine rollout, the World Health Organization decided that herd immunity does not come through natural infection, but rather only through inoculation. Now they flipped that back again, so maybe it was live a couple of weeks, but I mean, like, they actually changed the definition of herd immunity.
Yeah, just like they changed the definition of being vaccinated, and just how they changed the definition of the vaccine status, of deaths by vaccine status. I mean, it goes on and on.
Here's a question for you, because I've thought about this in the U.S. case. We had in the U.S. a number of seroprevalence studies. One was conducted quite early in the late spring of 2020, that's showing seroprevalence of COVID immunities was 10 times what was supposed. That was very early on. But then another and I'm not an expert on, I guess there have been many seroprevalence studies in the meantime, but one in late 2020 from South Dakota showed that seroprevalence was in the range of two-thirds and higher. So in other words, this is spooky to me, because what it means is that before anybody could really have access to the vaccine, the pathogen was already endemic. We'd already achieved endemicity.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why they went after the scientists who were promoting natural immunity, like Martin Kulldorff. He had a post on X. Again, there's a screenshot of it in my book, and you have a sticker on it, that this is disinformation, and he's talking about natural immunity, because they had to silence it was all about railroading, getting the vaccine in, blacklisting all the early COVID treatments, the cheap generic treatments like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and shutting down this sort of, natural immunity, which is completely scientific, evidence-based. But no, we had to follow the science, but it wasn't the science, it was their science.
It's hard to name what is the biggest single source of scandal here in this unbelievable disaster. But the idea that even if the vaccine had been effective, meaning stopping transition, and even if it had been safe, which it wasn't, the reality is, based on a lot that we know already, it may never have even been necessary, because endemicity had been achieved in most parts of the world by the time of the vaccine rollout. I mean, you don't disagree with that statement?
No, I completely agree with you. And also, to vaccinate against a virus, I mean, it's just, it's very bizarre. And we know viruses constantly mutate, right?
Yeah.
Always mutating. Doesn't stay the same.
Sonia, and Ted, I'm speaking to you on March 22nd. I don't know when we're going to put this up, as soon as we get the producer to upload it. But today's Washington Post has an article defending the lockdowns, right? And
defending lockdowns.
Yeah,
wow.
The lockdowns were great. And the shot rollout was great. And the article actually says, look, it was a very, very effective vaccine. The problem is that the virus mutated.
Okay. Yes.
That actually says that.
Yeah. Don't blame the vaccine. Blame the virus. Oh no, it's crazy, isn't it? Really crazy.
Well, let's wrap it up. But I just want to ask you, there's particular ways in which our world has been completely transformed by everything that happened, that not enough people are writing about, or not enough people understand. Your book lays it all out, and that's why I wrote in the foreword that I think it's a book for the ages. But it's not as if we did this bad thing happen to us and now it's over and life's back to normal, right? I mean, that is not the case.
No, this is why the final chapter is this rise of digital authoritarianism that we're seeing. We're seeing this complete push for digital IDs. Obviously, digital currencies, we know that's coming into play as well. But it's all in lockstep with the United Nations Agenda 2030 and their Sustainable Development Goals, particularly 16.9, which is universal identity for all, right? That's what, that's sort of in the play there. And we've got the rise of AI also. You've got AI with surveillance. I mean, in the UK, I'm using this as an example. You have facial recognition cameras being set up across various cities So they're sort of catching criminals, but it's like it's very creepy. It's very creepy.
Well, there was the red flag was, just the instant that the COVID hysteria was starting to die down, AI came along. Do you remember that? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like 1 minute to the next.
Yeah. And this is the ultimate control. You have real-time control where AI can literally scrape all your social media posts, know everything about you, where you're going, your location, your browsing history, and in real time do a whole profile for you. All about you. That they may. I mean, what will that be used for? That information that could be used for. You know what? You bought too much meat today. You can't buy another steak. That's your limit for the day. Because everything is going to be tracked. You've already flown, or you've already had a holiday. You can't, fly. What about your carbon footprint? So it's just, what kind of world are we going to be entering in? It's just more and more like China.
Yeah. So on the sixth anniversary of the lockdowns, the International Energy Agency released a 10-point plan for global energy rationing that would involve stay-at-home orders and digital surveillance of how much gasoline you're using, even how much propane you're using, or natural gas you're using for home cooking, against which they strongly recommend. It's like 10 points. That's basically, it's a lot of them are the same as the COVID measures: stay at home, essential,
Yes.
unessential, except it's amazing the same measures would work for controlling energy consumption that also work for controlling infectious disease. But there you go.
Yeah, all about control, isn't it, Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sonia, I'm so glad you spent this time with me. And I'm mostly, I hope there's some reward for you in this life or the next for having written this magnificent book. And I hope it gets a ton of attention. You don't have a major publisher. In fact, I think you self-published. You didn't have to, but I think you did the right thing.
I think I did.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's very scrupulous. And sales are going well, you think?
Yeah. Yeah, no, doing really well. Obviously was on Redacted. They just released that interview yesterday, and that's doing really well. This is with Clayton Morris, and hope to do more interviews and just spread the word. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a book. It was so important to just write an evidence-based book with so much research and to back it up, and the site, I really appreciate your advice about having an index, so readers can appreciate an index, and that all goes to you, Jeffrey, because you were like, you must have an index, and I'm like, okay. So that really, I think that's a really useful tool, and again, the timeline, and this chapter by chapter, it really it sort of encompasses all what went on and all what they did and what they got away with. And the aim of writing this book is to, yes, wake people up. It's to educate, to use knowledge, right? Knowledge and truth is the antidote.
All right, Sonia, if you're allowed to travel as we approach the end of the year, I certainly hope to bring you to the United States to do a little speaking for us. I would love to see
I
you
would love, I
and
would be
meet you
very
for the
honored.
first time. Yeah. Thank you
Oh,
so
that would be
much,
great.
Sonia Elijah. Your book is 311 Viral Takeover, available on Amazon. All the best to you.
Thank you. Take care.